doesn't also die after death. It would be foolish to say that the body is still alive. It is equally foolish to just assume the soul is also alive. So Epicurus believed that when you die, you're gone. Your soul may exist in the sense that your body continues to exist, but it's still dead. It is as dead as your body is. What do you think Christians thought of that nonsense? They really hated that. You can be a Christian and be a cokehead. You might not be a great Christian. You can't be a Christian, period, if you think that when people die, they're gone forever. That whole resurrection thing is kind of incompatible with Epicurean tradition. And if you read Dante, there is a special, particular punishment set aside for Epicurus for teaching this. For teaching people that when you die, the soul is gone. He is tortured in hell by God in Dante by showing, hey, guess what? You're still here. You get to experience all this lovely pain. Okay. So by a show of hands, after talking about Epicureanism for a while, how many of you think that it is an okay philosophy? You don't need to agree with it, but do you find it a legitimate way of looking at the world? By comparison, how many of you think that Epicurus may have been bonkers? How about somewhere in the middle? That wafts on, he may have had some ideas, but they're not sane sounding, sort of that kind of stuff. I want to backtrack for a second, because we started with Socrates. It's the appropriate place to start in an introduction to philosophy talk. There were people who were trying to figure out life before Socrates. They weren't really philosophers, they were more like cult leaders. Plato and Socrates and Epicurus, they're at least willing to look at reality and observe it and try to draw conclusions based on what they see. Religion tells you what things are, right? Earlier philosophical schools, to wit, Pythagoras, were more like that. Pythagoras was a guy who, in his opinion, came up with the way the world works and then taught other people that particular way of looking. He was not interested in criticism or alternative ways of seeing the world. Pythagoras stands out because he happens to be a particularly smart type of crazy person. So Pythagoras lived in Sicily. One day, he's out on a day like today playing the ancient Greek equivalent of bocce ball. And he's trying to beat his friend, and he's good at math. He's knocking balls into one another, and he notices that he can use math to predict where the ball will go. Fairly elementary physics, right? If you know the mass, speed, and the angle of collisions, you can predict where the other body is going to go, right? So he could do that. He was sort of like mathematically cheating at bocce ball. For whatever reason, on one particular day, when he was playing this game with his friend, he had this crazy person epiphany. He thought, well, if I can use math to predict where the ball is going to go, as long as I know enough of the variables around me, I can predict everything. Because the world is made of atoms. And if atoms are just colliding into one another and causing things around me, all I have to do is get better at math and study more. And eventually I can predict the future. So he was a very mathematically capable schizophrenic. But he was still knucking futz. Let's not beat around the bush. Pythagoras was crazy. He expanded upon this mathematical view of philosophy to include other things, like to truly gain transcendental wisdom, you shouldn't bathe. So he didn't bathe for the last 30 years of his life. He also thought, he was a vegetarian, he thought eating meat was bad, but he also thought that certain plants had souls as well, so the only acceptable form of food is beans. Pythagoreans were only allowed to eat beans.
Of course.
Combine that with not bathing, it must have been a very pleasant experience to be around them. But he descended in the later years of his life into an increasingly Howard Hughes-like state, where his hair got long, his fingernails got long, he didn't bathe, and he mumbled to himself, and he was constantly obsessed with the mathematical workings of the universe around him, but without any real system of observing the universe. He didn't have the type of instruments you need to even get close to actual predictive physics. It takes centuries past him after that. But he discovered the Pythagorean theorem. Only he didn't. People had known that for centuries, thousands of years even. Go to Egypt. There are pyramids. Pyramids are triangles. They figured this out long before Pythagoras. Do you know why Pythagoras gets credit for discovering that theorem? Because in his Howard Hughes-like craziness, he formed the first practical mathematical proof of it by doing it 10,000 times in a row. That was mathematical evidence that it was true. People had actually applied it long before that. So his insanity gets him his place in the history books. He's actually quite a bonkers philosopher as far as it goes. So, you can see why people like Epicurus and Plato are a huge step above Pythagoras. They allow you to not eat just beans, if nothing else. So, I mentioned yesterday that Plato gives rise to two big schools. Aristophanes of Cyrene is a student who gives birth sort of to Epicurus. You get hedonists out of this. Relativists, people who do what they want when they want, and they define good and evil that way. A different student of Plato goes in a very different direction. Our buddy Aristotle. Who can tell me about Aristotle before I tell you about Aristotle? Do tell.
What's that?
Tell anything you want about him. What was his favorite color? Did he smell like sandalwood?
Yes. Aristotle, he kind of took Plato's idea of forms to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
He thought being was sameness, so like, I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain, but anyway, he just pretty much took Plato's ideas to the next level. That's really horrible.
So, allow me to elucidate on that. Yes, he took Plato's idea to their next level. Plato was a big believer in this theory of forms thing. He talked about the chair in your head, that sort of thing. Aristotle believed that that was true, but it was meaningless in application. Nobody has any impact on their life if some magical godly chair exists somewhere in the universe and we're all channeling it. What does matter is what we as people observe and interact with in our real lives. His first great leap was inductive logic. Who has taken logic before or talked about it in math class? Not for our purposes, no. We could have talked about Pythagoras more, but at least not with inductive logic.
Yes.
What is inductive logic? I heard saw your hand go up.
Well, I mean, it's like taking two things and then making assumptions based on what you already know.
Yep. We should say that all logic is assumptions. Some logic is more provable in their assumptions than other. Inductive logic contrasts with deductive logic. Inductive logic is this. Every person I have ever seen is taller than 36 inches. Therefore, all people are taller than 36 inches. Every swan I have ever seen is white. Therefore, there are no swans that aren't white. Deductive logic is working in the other direction, saying that humans are never shorter than 12 inches. Therefore, Mary Frances is not shorter than 12 inches. Which one is more generalizing, inductive or deductive? Inductive, right. Because you take smaller things of observed things and you try to apply them to everything. Deductive is where you take big things and apply them to smaller things. Like, if all people are tall, then Mary Catherine is tall. Big group, small conclusion. Deductive logic is almost always right, as long as your assumptions are right. Inductive logic can be wrong. My statement that all swans are white are true until I find a black swan. Exactly. The fact that every swan I have ever seen is white doesn't mean that black swans don't exist, right? It's a very good step in the right direction because Aristotle is thinking logically, but you can poke holes at it. As far as he's concerned, those poked holes don't matter enough because you get enough truth logically observing reality inductively for his purposes. So, Aristotle is trying to find a meaning to existence. He starts by thinking about eyeballs. Plato started thinking about chairs, and he got to his conclusion. Aristotle tried to figure out not just good and evil for academic reasons. He didn't want to just debate what good is or what evil is, and he didn't want to go down a hedonist path. He didn't just want to do cocaine all day. He wanted to try and find a way to give human existence meaning. Why are we here? And by looking at eyeballs first, he thought to himself, what is the purpose of an eyeball? To see. Eyeballs see things. A good eyeball sees things. A bad eyeball doesn't see things. If somebody walks up to you and pokes you in both eyes with pencils, your eyes are now bad. There's not necessarily a moral component attached to your eyes not functioning anymore, but they are no longer good eyes, right? So good eyes see. Good birds fly. Good clouds pour rain on people. What do good people do? Why are we here? If humans are things, and we're pretty sure that we are, we must have a purpose, the same way other objects observably have a purpose. That can be inferred with inductive logic and therefore proven in some way. Aristotle's notion of what the purpose of life is, what makes a person a good person, is what he calls arete. Anybody from a philosophy introductory course know what arete means? Huh? Alpha rho epsilon tau eta, with an accent on the eta.
Thanks.
It's a Greek word, what can I say? He speaks Greek. Arete means something like